Hey guys, welcome back to Chris and Retro. Tonight's video is going to be, I guess I'll pause for a second. You ever had something you just kind of look at and you're like, I'm curious about that? Well, that's been happening to me a lot lately with people. So one of the things I do on the TikTok platform is a lot of times I'll quote inspirational quotes or whatever else, but I pause sometimes when I'm not sure if I know who the author is. And I'll usually do like a quick background check because I want to make sure I'm not promoting the voice of somebody that does wholly something I disagree with. So I'm pretty careful about that, generally speaking. I'm sure I've missed a few over time, but it happens. I generally try to be careful about that. If you watch the Declaration of Independence video, it's along the same vein. I was curious about the people behind that Declaration of Independence video. Well, today I walked by a poster. Well, it's a canvas sign that Sam and I have in our home, and it's right outside the office here. And it's one of those nice things, and I'll get to what it was here later on in the video, but it's one of those nice things that keeps you going, kind of think about it. You're like, yeah, I can get that. I refer to it often. Actually, I have over the last 7 years referred to it very much, and you'll understand why. But I noticed the author there, and I'd never noticed who wrote it. I don't know why. I'm sure that if I was a zealot in the recovery community more so than I am, I probably would have known everything about this, but I just don't. So I noticed the name, and I'm like, that looks like a German name. Interest, because Sam's a German. She's German descent, German Irish. And it just made me curious. So I dug into this person and found some very interesting things. So today, that's how I found this person's name. I'm not changing the genre of the channel. I'm not going to be doing this, historical accounts of people. But when we're talking about, certain characters and certain things that we've drawn from for strength or whatever else, it's kind of good to know what else is to the story. And to me, it's a little bit interesting to find out some of it. So I'm going to share with you Karl Paul Reinhold Niebuhr, known more commonly as Reinhold Niebuhr. He was born on June 21st of 1892. He died June 1st, 1971. So about a year and a month before I was born, he passed away. He was known as basically a theologian. He's well-spoken, well-educated. Some observations about his characters. I read a little bit more about him. I'm kind of curious about a few things they're not even really implying them, but I'm kind of reading between the lines on something here, and I'll share that with you as well. So he started out as a socialist and a pacifism supporter. I find that really honestly so interesting to me as we look at our current society in the United States and how people are just so passive and they don't want to fight and they're getting gun controls and everybody live and let live and that type of thing, but they all lean towards this very controlling, freedom sacrificing socialism as like the place to be pacifist. Actually, all that does is put you in a situation where you have no control over your life, and pacifism is not really anything that you can choose because you're being mandated into subservience. Pacifism and subservience are two completely different things, and I think that people are misguided when they align with socialistic type thinking it's going to align with their pacifist approach, and actually it's just making them subservient to a power that's on earth that can dominate them and take their resources. That's my opinion. But he changed that. He changed that opinion, and he started to speak out against communism. Now, while he was a self-proclaimed socialist, he wasn't really so far as Marxism or anything like that, but he was more of a softer version of it. It's still all the same. It's black and white to me. However, he had some distinction with that, and he's obviously more educated than I was. However, he then decided to speak out against that, started speaking very publicly against communism. He was largely as an influencer of modern day Democrats and some of their thinking. And a few examples would be Martin Luther King Jr. cited him a lot. Hillary Clinton has talked about him. Barack Obama has talked about him. He's had a number of, academic and theological characters and well-known characters that have called on referencing him in terms of some keynote speaking and that type of thing. So he's had influence. Sometimes people call on people that are well-spoken or well-read to show their own intelligence. So maybe there was some of that. But there does seem to be an alignment, and those that called on him, there's some consistency in terms of what they would believe as well, with the exception of Martin Luther King Jr. And I think that that's actually being blown a little bit out of proportion because, he's only really cited him one time that I could find. He was German born. His father was a pastor. And I'm getting to this. I know, guys, I'm reading this whole thing. And you're like, oh, yeah, great biography. Thanks so much for telling me about somebody I know absolutely nothing about. But when I come at the end of this thing, you'll understand why the tie-in is here. And I found it very interesting. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this information at this point. So I may end this thing with basically a cliffhanger and say, let me get back to you. Because I still don't know what I'm going to do with the information. But it's curious to me. So in 1915, he was ordained as a pastor. So he was born in 1892. And so by 23, he was a pastor. He had a church of 66 people. By 1928, So that would be 13 years later. In 13 years, he grew it from 66 people to 700. Now, this was in Detroit. And in Detroit, there was a lot of social economic issues going on. And there was a huge rise in the KKK. And so they were about 20,000 strong in the city of Detroit at this time. And he spoke out against them very publicly. What was interesting is there weren't a lot of KKK backers that were running for office, but there was one. And he won a judge position and later on went to be a city mayor in Detroit, which I found that interesting that, that they had that kind of influence back then, and maybe they do today, I don't know, but they had that kind of influence back then that they could actually put a judge in a seat and have him ultimately become a city mayor when the city was a good mix of different types of races. He had a tendency, this makes sense in the Detroit area, he had a tendency to sympathize with the working class. So now that is consistent with his pacifism approach, is that this idea of people and the humanness of them. And so he was really sensitive towards the auto workers and was really had a lot of work around that relative to those that are working and really trying hard. He wasn't really all that. He was supportive of those that had power and money, only so much as that they would refer to some of his thought process on things. But he really was more so for the working class, which was, I think, honorable. Now, this is where it gets interesting. He has had some controversy. So he was first focused as a pastor when he went from basically just theological studies to actually being an ordained minister. He was trying to convert people from Judaism to Christianity. And he wanted to see that change because of his belief system. He also backed off of that. So he changed that position as well. He was a rival of John Dewey, who really, everything that I've seen, I don't know John Dewey, but as I looked up some of the stuff there, they really were polar opposites in terms of their position. So it's almost like they raised each other's profile by being so vastly different in their viewpoint and clashing with differences relative to that. By 1930, he was a prominent leader. He was a permanent leader of the Party of America. And it seemed to soften some of his position relative to his view on Jewish conversion and other things. Well, this is one observation, though, and this is Chris commentary, so this isn't necessarily I saw a documentation on. But what I'm concerned about is when I look through some of his history, he vacillated. There seemed to be a lot of vacillating. He'd take strong positions on something and back off. You can't take a half-measure position on socialism and pacifism. You can't do that. If you're going to speak out and be a voice of those things and admittedly do that stuff and make it blatantly clear what you're standing for, then to back off and say, I don't know about that. A couple things are going on. Either you're a political animal and you're trying to make sure that you're winning favor with whatever the dominant opinion is in the area, or I'd say a couple different things. Or you could just be weak and can't handle any rejection or pushback. You can pop off all you want until somebody says, no, I'm going to deal with you. And then also you're like, oh, no, I'm sorry. Or you can be shady and doing it behind the scenes and just not doing it as vocal anymore and covering it, veiling it with maybe a softer position. I don't know. So the socialism thing was one he did it with. The other thing is he did it obviously with this Jewish conversion thing. That was kind of interesting to me. And then his public opposition of the KKK seemed to soften. Not that he was supporting of them, but his vocal public opposition seemed to soften with that as well. And I found all that very interesting, that he was vacillating on these very prominent things that people noted him for and the power of his speaking. And so one of the things they talked about is him being a very charismatic speaker. He had a low voice and blue eyes, they cited. And apparently he was a very charismatic speaker. Now here's a picture of him for your edification. This is I imagine this is later on in his life, but this is a picture of him, Reinhold. And his speaking apparently was charismatic. He was well-spoken. He was understood his subject matter, but he also was very vocal about a few things, and those things he seemed to always back off on, which I find odd. Just to me, that's just odd. It's not really something I know what to do with. So that was curious to me. But here's where the curiosity really stepped up for me. Okay, so now we're talking about somebody that is promoting socialism and openly interested in doing that. No questions asked, promoting socialism and interested in, he's saying he started his whole thing out as socialist. So that was early on in his career. So that was probably around the 1915 time, like when he was 23. So 22 years later, he wrote this. and you guys got to peek at it because I'm bad with the mouse. He wrote the Serenity Prayer. Now, for those of you that don't know the Serenity Prayer, this is a hallmark of AA and recovery. I hearken on the Serenity Prayer all the time, like all the time. I constantly am quoting certain pieces of it. And there's one that I really get with this thing is that accepting hardships is a pathway to peace. Accepting that pain is my pathway to peace. That's something I draw from all the time, is that when I'm going through hard times, a lot of times peace is on the other side because I have to go through this lesson. They say iron sharpens iron. It's not a pleasant process. You've got to go through that to find peace. And sometimes it's just to find new tools and to grow. What I found interesting is, so the canvas that I have outside of here has the Serenity Prayer on it, and it just has Niebuhr underneath it citing who wrote it. And I'd never seen that before. And here I have somebody saying, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and have the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships is a pathway to peace. Taking as he did, the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right. If I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him. I've seen versions of this that say in the next. This was not the original version of it. He had a variant of it, but it was very similar in terms of its sentiment. Now, I've seen quotes that he's had, and there's other things that seem to be consistent with this type of thinking. But how can I take somebody that was a socialist early on, and then 22 years later is now writing the Serenity Prayer, which is a hallmark of recovery? Somebody that's a pacifist and in terms of their view on life and how they look at things, but yet the most aggressive fight you'll ever fight is getting your sobriety back, or getting sobriety in the first place for many. I found it interesting. What do I do with this information? I warned you already. I have no clue. Do I stop? Because I'm completely opposed to socialism and how it softens our sensitivity so that we can have more control, have people have more control over us. I'll never change my position on that. However, this to be a very powerful work in my life and many, many, many other people that I know, the Serenity Prayer is drawn on. I mean, to the point they've tattooed. I know so many people that have it tattooed on their body because it's such a powerful thought process. I've written a song about it. Actually, on my iBlock Chronicles, I put a blog up last night that has a reference to the Serenity Prayer on it. So there's it is a powerful body of work, and I'm not refuting Reinhold Niebuhr and his intellect, his speaking capabilities and everything else. The only thing I say is that he had a lot of vacillating going on in his life where he would make big, bold statements and then fall back down. And so one work that seemed to hold the test of time was the Serenity Prayer. So I guess what I'll do is I'll close this whole background and this little history lesson on Reinhold Niebuhr, the author of the Serenity Prayer, and simply say he did one thing that lasted and he stuck by it. And it had some iterations and variants of it over the years since 1937. However, it's in large part the exact same thing. So good job on one thing that you stuck with. And I'm probably disparaging a man that had a lot of really noble things with him. But as I read through it, I was just kind of like curious, if you're really going to stand for something, why are you backing off all the time on every big thing you stand for? So who knows? It does seem like he stood by the auto workers. I didn't see him fall back on that one either. And again, keep in mind that I'm not a historian. I'm certainly not a theologian. I did a brief history on something I was curious about on a poster. And I was enlightened to the fact that somebody I really had respected up to this point is somebody that I'm completely opposed to in my political beliefs. So maybe it's another illustration that says, look, we don't know people and what they believe. All we can know is where we connect. And maybe there's lessons that we can learn from each one of us, regardless of what our backstory is or what our story is or what our story in general is, or even what our belief system is. Sometimes we can connect on things that just make a difference in our lives. So maybe that's what the lesson is for me. I don't know. Maybe you'll find something different for you, but I thought it was interesting and I wanted to share it with you tonight. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. I really appreciate your comments on the channel. Thanks so much for sticking with me as we get back on our feet here with the program and in life in general. Between now and the next time we talk, please, I'm going to stay out of trouble. I hope you do too.